you shall serve. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and ministered to him. You find the account of Jesus' temptation in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. And if you've studied Matthew, Mark, and Luke comparatively very much, then you know that they overlap in some ways, and yet they are very distinct in their own right. And to me, when you find an account that God has included in all three, especially in Matthew and Luke, where you have an expanded account like you do of this, then we probably need to give some special attention to that particular event. I mean, Jesus lived for 33 years on the earth, roughly. And you think how little we really know about his day-to-day life. We know about his teaching. We know about some of the things that he did during his 3 years of public ministry. But the reality is God has been very selective in regards to what he has recorded for us. And he's done that for a reason, because the things that he has recorded are the things that we need to create faith, so that we can put our trust in him, so that we can have confidence in who he is and what he did and what he is doing and the promises that he has made. And so when you read an event like this, it merits some extra attention. And let me say to you at the outset, there are things going on in this account that I don't understand. And I want to kind of come back to that as we go along. Jesus' temptation and the overcoming of such, in many ways, as we understand, is absolutely vital to our salvation. In Hebrews chapter 2 and again in chapter 4, where Jesus is portrayed to us as the perfect high priest, we are told that he was tempted like we are tempted, so that he might be able to sympathize with us, so that he can appreciate what we go through. And I find that interesting. I mean, Jesus was God the Word, before he came to the earth. And as God, I believe that God is infinite in his knowledge. I think he understands and knows everything. And yet, in order that he might properly intercede for us as a high priest, he went through what he went through, not because he didn't intellectually understand it, but so that we might see that he can sympathize with us. That we can't ever say, well, God, you don't know how I feel. Yes, he does. And part of the reason that we have this account is simply so that we can have some confidence in him as an intercessor. Part of the reason we have the account is because Jesus had to be a perfect sacrifice. And in order to be a perfect sacrifice, he had to deal with sin, and he had to overcome temptation so that he might stand before us as the perfect example and as a sacrifice that did not deserve to die. This is an exceptionally significant event in the life of Jesus. But I suspect we don't appreciate the severity of it. I am intrigued by the fact that twice Satan begins his temptation by saying, if you are the Son of God. And I have some ideas about what that may refer to, but I think there's probably a lot more going on there than we realize. Moreover, this is not the only temptation in the life of Jesus. In Luke's account, we are told that at the end of this, Satan left him until a more opportune time. Satan came back and tempted him again. And my suspicion is that at 30 years old, Jesus had dealt with a lot of temptation in his life, just like we all do. And yet, this is here. And so the question I want to entertain is why? What is it that God intends for us to understand other than the things we've already mentioned? Well, you read about the temptation to Jesus, you learn a lot about Satan. You learn about the way he works. And in fact, you have two accounts in the Bible of very detailed temptations that Satan has presented to people. You see it in Genesis chapter 3 with Adam and Eve. And you see it in Matthew chapter 4 with Jesus. And there are a lot of parallels between those two accounts. And so we can study those things and we can learn about Satan. We can study this account. We can learn about Jesus. We can learn about the process. And we can prepare ourselves. Now, let me ask you a question. We are moral beings created in the image of God. We understand right and we understand wrong. And God has asked us to be holy and is holding us to a standard. That means if there's an adversary that is real, that temptation is an inevitable moral reality that we're all going to face. So my question to you is, what are you doing to prepare? You know, it's interesting to me that we're all going to go out tonight and tomorrow and the day after and the day after and the day after, and we've committed ourselves to being disciples of Jesus, and we recognize how powerful our adversary is, and yet if somebody says, what are you doing to prepare to face Satan? We would go, I got nothing. We make a plan for everything. We make a plan for how we raise our kids. We make a plan for what we do when we get married. We make a plan for our business. We make a plan for our education. We make a plan for everything. Why don't we have a plan for this? And so that's what I want to offer you. I want to look at the temptation of Jesus, and I want to offer a plan for dealing with temptation, because I think it's all here. And the first thing I want to propose to you is that if we're going to be properly prepared to resist the devil, then we need to be serious about the process. One of the interesting things about Satan is that our culture has kind of characterized him or made a caricature out of him. You understand what a caricature is? This is one of those yes or no. You know, where you exaggerate someone's physical appearance, and you do so basically kind of in order to make them singular in their appearance, or make them memorable, or in some ways to kind of make them less imposing. When you think of Satan, what's your picture? When I was a kid, they had good cartoons, okay? And, you know, you had Tom and Jerry and Bugs Bunny and the Roadrunner and all those guys. And I can still remember, and I don't remember all the details of it, but I can remember that it wasn't uncommon that you would see a temptation dilemma in a cartoon. In the way that you know, maybe it was the Roadrunner about to drop the anvil on the coyote. And you'd see a little mini image of the character on each shoulder. Do you remember that? On one side, it is the image, maybe it's Bugs Bunny, and he's got a halo, and he's got wings, and he's got a harp, and he's over there going, don't do that. We don't do that. And on the other side is the same little Bugs Bunny guy, but this time he's dressed in red. He's got coveralls on. He's got a long tail with a point on the end of it, and he's got a forked tongue. And he's got a pitchfork in his hand, and he's over there whispering, oh, do it. And that's the way that you know, we have kind of portrayed temptation. Why do we do that? Well, I think it makes Satan a little less imposing to us. And what our culture's done is basically just made Satan nothing more than a cartoon character or a fairy tale. And if you've ever studied with anybody, especially if you've studied the origins of temptation and sin in the world, you've gone to Genesis chapter 3, at some point, especially if they're somewhat skeptical, they're going to say, look, do you really believe that Eve was talking to a snake? Now, are you really going to tell me that you're an educated person with a college degree and you believe that Eve was talking to a snake? And my response to that is, yes. Yeah, I believe that really happened. And they go, how do you expect me to believe that? Why are people so skeptical? Well, because we're not too serious about Satan in our culture. We just kind of marginalized him, made him where he's not very believable, and because he's not very believable, he's not very threatening. So if he's not threatening, then temptation's not such a big deal, and if temptation's not such a big deal, sin's not such a big deal. And now we are at a state, in this country anyway, where we just glamorize sin. You look at advertisements on TV, most of them are not lauding godly qualities. Most of them are draping all kinds of ungodliness on the product to try to get our attention. And what that does for Christians, folks, is it makes us a little less serious about the whole process. It makes us think of Satan in terms that are less than he is. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, which is the passage that we generally associate when we think about Satan, we are told to be sober and vigilant because our adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walks about seeking whom he may devour. Now let me ask you, are you serious about that warning? that God offers to us about Satan? Do you really believe that, I start saying, he's out there, that he's in here right now, and you've got a target on you, the little laser dot that somebody's got on their gun? Satan's got on you and on me to try to deter us from serving God. Do you really believe that? My wife and my girls, I started to say kid with me. They make fun of me on a pretty regular basis because I'm one of these guys that everything's very just or unjust. Now, I get frustrated with the injustice in the world. Ecclesiastes is my favorite book in the Bible because it just rants against injustice. And I'll pull it over here that, you know, this person should have done that, or that person should have done that, or that person pulled out. And they're convinced now that I'm paranoid, that everybody in the world is out to get me. And my response to them is, it's not paranoia if it's true. I want you to understand something about Satan. It is not paranoia. If the Bible is accurate about Jesus dying on the cross, then the Bible is accurate about Satan tempting Jesus. And if the Bible is accurate about Satan tempting Jesus, then the Bible is accurate about Satan tempting Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3. And he really did appear as a snake, and he is really out to get you, and he's really out to get me, and he is very, very good at what he does. And this can't be a trite consideration with us. Why do you think Jesus was successful here? Go back to Matthew chapter 4. Satan tempts him over and over. He's in the wilderness for 40 days. He has been driven there by the Spirit because this is necessary as a part of his work as the Messiah. And now he's having to deal with Satan. Why do you think he is as successful as he is? Let me propose to you at the very outset, it's because he was very serious about the process. Think about it. What happens if Jesus fails? Just one time. You know, we've just got the events that take place right after his baptism and at the beginning of his ministry. We don't learn anything about Jesus as a teenager, but he's a teenage boy. He would have had the same desires, the same frustrations, the same growing pains, the same striving for independence from his parents. All those things that you go through in adolescence, Jesus went through. And yet, every day of his life, you think about this, from the time he was conscious of his job, and we know that at 12, he knew that he had to be about his Father's business. So as early as 12, Jesus understood completely who he was and what he was here to do. Every day of his life, he carried this burden. If I fail today, I fail forever. And not one person in the history of mankind's existence on the face of the earth can be in association with God if he fails. Do you think Jesus took this seriously? When Satan shows up and says, hey, here's these rocks here, why don't you turn them to bread? I know you're hungry, you haven't eaten for 40 days. And we look at it and we start going through the process. Well, I don't understand what the sin is. What's the sin in turning this stuff to? Part of the deal is, who is it that's going to make the decisions for Jesus? And Jesus' concern is, I have to be holy or I can't do my job. Well, let me propose to you, when we start taking temptation that way, it'll make us more effective. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, when Moses is reviewing the last 40 years essentially with the children of the people that came out of Canaan. This is after the generation has died in the wilderness. And they're about to go into the promised land. And he goes through this kind of abbreviated history, and he lays out the blessings and the curses and all that God has done for them and all that God's promised them and what God expects of them. When you get to the end of chapter 30, he says, look, speaking for God, I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. It's decision time. The decision you make right now and every day forward is going to determine life or death, blessing or cursing. Let me make this suggestion to you. we view every temptation that way. What do you think is going to happen if you die in sin? You believe if you die in sin, you're going to be lost eternally and go to hell? Nod your head yes if you believe that. Every time? Or just sometimes? I sin today that God's going to forget that one. But tomorrow, that's going to be a serious one. Do you see where I'm going with this? If we looked at every temptation, I don't know what your temptations are. I don't know what your challenges are as a Christian. I don't know if you've come out of a life of immorality and you're trying to change habits that you established for a long time. I don't know if you were raised by Christians and you have to deal with things that sometimes you have to deal with when we're raised among godly people. Self-righteousness, despise for the world, despite for the world. There are a lot of things that may tempt you. I don't know what yours are. But I'm going to tell you something about them. If you don't deal with them, you can lose your soul. And every time we are faced with temptation, we need to be serious about what's happening right then and right now. And I think, first of all, if we do that, we'll be better off. Now, the second thing I think you see in Jesus is that as he is dealing with Satan, Jesus is focused upon what is spiritual. This is kind of an interesting point about the temptation process to me. Satan always uses the same tools when he tempts us. God gives us some insight into that. 1 John 2, we mentioned this morning, all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, not of the followers of the world. And pretty much any temptation you want to talk about can kind of fall into one of those three categories. It's either something we see that we desire, it's something that our body desires, it's something that appeals to our ego and our pride and our sense of self, and pretty much every temptation is going to fall into those categories. And so if we're going to deal with temptation, we need to understand that that's where it's coming from. That's where the attack is going to happen. You see it in Genesis chapter 3. What was it that Satan said to Eve when Eve, can you eat of every tree of the garden? Well, we eat every tree but this one. Why can't you eat out of this? Well, God told us we'd surely die. Oh, you're not going to die. You will not surely die. And then at some point, without giving us the whole conversation, Eve starts looking at the tree and whatever it is that Satan's whispering in her ear. And it looked good for food. And it looked good as far as it was desirable to the eye. And she recognized from what Satan told her, if you eat it, God knows you'll be like him. You'll be wise. And she saw that it was desirable. Well, what was he appealing to? It appeared to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, the pride of life. What is he doing with Jesus? He takes him up on a temple, tells him to throw himself off. I don't know if that's display that Satan is after. I don't know if it's just a simple idea of testing God. But here's this desire to be seen. Takes him up on a high mountain, shows him all the kingdoms. We talked this morning about Jesus being the king. And the fact of the matter is, I'm convinced that that's what he came to do. That's what Peter preached in Acts 2, that he ascended to the throne after his resurrection. And that's what Jesus came to do, to be the king who wins victory for his people. And Satan's offering him a shortcut. You bow down to me, you can rule the world. I suspect Satan knew part of what Jesus was coming for. And so Satan is offering Jesus the very things that he offered Eve and the very thing he offers us. James chapter 1 says we are tempted when we're drawn away by our own desires and enticed. Now, what does being serious, spiritual, have to do with that? I want to propose to you the real key to Jesus' success here. And it wasn't the quoting of Scripture. Now, I understand, and we tend to go there immediately. Why was Jesus successful? Because he said it is written. Every time he's tempted, he comes back with, it is written. Have you ever failed in a temptation knowing full well that it was wrong? Yes or no? Come on, shake your head. Yes, I know the answer. You might as well admit it to me, okay? Knowledge most of the time is not the problem, is it? Do not let the sun go down in your wrath. Do not be quick to anger. Be angry and sin not. I am very short-tempered. Always have been. Don't know why. Like to blame it on somebody else, but it is my burden. And I know what God says about it. But when somebody pulls out in front of me, there's the temptation. And I can tell myself, be angry and sin not. And I just hadn't figured out where the sin part comes in. The anger part I've got down. And the reality is I can say all day long it is written, but it's not a totem. It's not a magic charm to be able to quote Scripture and suddenly you don't give in to temptation. I want to propose there's something more going on here. And I think the reason that Jesus is so successful is because all Jesus wanted to do in his life was please God. And falling to temptation was going to be personal with him. I want you to notice something. Go back to Matthew 4, and I've mentioned this a couple times in the past. In verse 3, Satan says, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to turn bread. Again, in verse 6, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. I don't understand everything that's going on here, but if you back up to the end of chapter 3, or if you read Luke's account at the end of Luke chapter 3, the last thing that we are told by Matthew and Luke, and Mark as well, before Jesus' temptation, we're told about Jesus' baptism. Do you remember what happens at Jesus' baptism with regards to God the Father? The Spirit descends on Jesus as a dove, which was the sign so John the Baptist would know that Jesus was the Messiah. But you also have God speaking. And God's statement is, in Matthew, this is my beloved Son. In Luke, it is you are my beloved Son. And I find that intriguing. I don't understand everything about Jesus as being both God and man. I believe that he was fully. And I'm not going to debate that with anybody. But it is intriguing. What did Jesus understand? You know, people have this question. Did Jesus as a baby, did he have divine knowledge? I don't know. But at some point, Jesus understood who he was. Whether as a child, by 12 he certainly did. And so at his baptism, God speaks not only for the benefit of those around, but in part for the benefit of Jesus. You are my beloved Son. I am putting my stamp of approval on you. Is this encouraging Jesus to prepare for his ministry? I think in some ways it has to be. Jesus had to live as a man even though he was God. He prayed to God. He looked to God for strength. God sent angels to minister to him. He dealt with things the way that we deal with things. And so I think part of what Satan's doing is trying to create doubt. I don't know if Satan understood exactly who Jesus was. But his question is, if you really are the Son of God, prove it. And Jesus' reply essentially is, I am not going to defy my Father trying to prove to you who I am. When Jesus dealt with temptation, all he wanted to do was to make sure and please God. Read John chapter 6 and verse 38. I came down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. You go over a couple of chapters later, in John chapter 8 and verse 29, Jesus' statement is, I always do those things that please the Father. And so, day in and day out, whenever and however Jesus was conscious of who he was as the Son of God in the flesh, what Jesus was wanting to do was to make sure that God was pleased with him. Like we talked about this morning, about seeking the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Jesus was seeking his righteousness. But it was personal with him. He didn't want to disappoint his Father. I believe that was what drove Jesus to the cross. I want to do what my Father wants me to do. Did you have good parents? If you have good parents, and if you're grown, I can tell you that looking back on your life, your respect for your parents probably influenced more decisions that you made than you can possibly number. I can think of times when I was a teenager that I didn't do some things that I really would have liked to have done, that all of my acquaintances from school were involved in. And the only reason, and I'd like to say it was because I was a Christian and I wanted to serve God. But the big reason was I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing my folks. It would kill me if I did something to bring dishonor on my dad, to bring dishonor on my mom. And I think for people who have good parents, that is something that we learn real young that drives us. And you young folks, a couple of you shook your head when I said you have a good parent. Don't ever lose sight of that. It will save you a lot of trouble down the road. Do you appreciate that that's what drove Jesus? What would be the harm in turning stones to bread? Nobody's there to see it. Well, Jesus' response is, here's the way my Father thinks about that. My Father wants me to put so much trust in Him that all I really need is His Word. Man shall not live by bread alone, only by the Word of God. And you can take me up on a temple and you can cause me to be thrown off. And I recognize that the psalmist has written that his angels will lift you up and catch you lest you dash your foot against a stone. Satan is accurately, he's misusing, but he's accurately quoting the 91st Psalm. But Jesus didn't have to put His Father to the test. Jesus had such confidence in God. Basically what He's telling Satan is, God said don't do that. You trust Him, you don't have to test Him. Takes Him up on a high pinnacle, takes Him up on the mountain, shows Him all the kingdoms. Fall down and worship me. That's not what my Father wants. What my Father wants is for me to fall down and worship Him. And the answer about the "it is written" part is powerful because what it says is that Jesus knew what His Father wanted. Do you study your Bible with that in mind? Do you do a daily Bible reading? Do you give yourself just to a fundamental knowledge of God? Do you take the time and go back and learn how God did this and how God did that? That's the value of the Old Testament, folks. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Romans chapter 10, 17 is talking about the Old Testament. We learn about God, how He thinks, how He acts, how He promises, how He keeps His promises, His faithfulness, the way He deals with sin, the way He deals with holiness. We learn about Him and we're trusting the same way we learn to trust anybody else. The more you learn about them, the more they are either trustworthy or not trustworthy. Do you study your Bible so that you know what your Father wants? So that when you're tempted, you can be spiritual enough to go, this is against my Father's will. I will not disappoint my Father. That's step number 2. Tomorrow, if you're going to deal with temptation, be serious about what's happening. And be spiritual in the sense that I am going to please my Father. Number 3. Go back to Matthew chapter 4. I want you to notice something that you see here. In the very first 2 verses, Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And when He had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, afterward He was hungry. Jesus was there 40 days and 40 nights out in the Judean countryside. What do you think Jesus was doing during that 40 days? Studying wildlife? Hunting and fishing on the mountains of Judea? Hanging out with the shepherds, getting a little insight so he can properly use shepherd illustrations as he goes about. What do you think Jesus was doing? 40 days is a long time. And he is out there just before he begins his ministry, just after he is baptized, just after God confirms to him that he is pleased with what he is doing and where he is going with his life, and he knows what's coming next. What do you think he's doing? I want to propose to you, he spent a whole lot of time talking to his Father. And Luke is especially given to this. Jesus, as he goes about his ministry, and there's crowds of people around him all the time. Everywhere he goes, the show comes to town. And I think that probably was the way that it was. He's doing miracles. He's teaching. He doesn't teach like the rabbis do. It's not like it is in the synagogue. He's paying attention to poor people. He's feeding people. He's healing people. I mean, it had to be like a circus when Jesus came to town. And we learn that from time to time he's just crowded by folks. In Matthew 9, when the lady comes behind him with the issue of blood and touches him, and Jesus turned around and said, "Who touched me?" The apostles go, "What do you mean who touched you? There's people all over you. Everybody's touching you." Well, when Jesus wanted to get away from that, what did he do? He'd go off and pray. Go off to be by himself so we could talk to the Father. I'm going to make this the third step in our plan for dealing with temptation. And that is, talk to the Father. Ask for help. It is amazing how much power there is in just stopping in the middle of the process of temptation and focusing upon God's will. God, I need your help right now. God, I'm dealing with this right now. God, this is happening to me right now. And I'll tell you what that kind of focus demands. It demands a certain degree of intimacy with God. We have that with friends or with our spouse. Something's bothering us. We can usually tell, "Hey, are you okay?" And if we're close to them, we'll say, "Well, yeah, you got a minute? Let me just vent." And we'll kind of pour out our heart. We get it off our chest. We get somebody that can sympathize with us. Or maybe somebody that can help us. If it's a friend, somebody that's wise, an older person. "I need your help. I need your advice." We're quick to do that. Why don't we do that with God? Why are we humble enough in regards to our own inability to deal with our temptations to stop in the middle of the process whenever Satan is pushing our buttons and say, "God, I need your help." Prayer is an acknowledgement of faith, and very often an acknowledgement of need. And I want to propose to you that that's what Jesus was doing. He was getting himself ready for what was facing him. For 3 years of teaching and preaching and being rejected and being hailed and having people that are confused to the point that they finally killed him, and he talked to God about that a lot. In Matthew chapter 6 and Luke chapter 11, you have the Lord's Prayer that Jesus includes. One of the things that Jesus tells us to pray for, and Luke's account is kind of the more interesting because in Luke's account, Jesus has been praying and the apostles come and ask him, "Teach us to pray." And one of the things that he taught them to pray was, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." Do you take that very seriously? Or is that just one of those, the Lord's Prayer for a lot of people is just kind of one of those things you repeat without thinking it through? Well, God tells us, Jesus tells us, when you talk to God, ask God for deliverance from Satan's work. And that's part of resisting the devil. That's part of being prepared. Learning to speak to God. Hebrews chapter 4, I mentioned in the introduction that Hebrews chapter 2 and Hebrews chapter 4 help us to understand Jesus' job as a high priest. Listen to what the Hebrew writer says in chapter 4 and in verse 14 and following. "Seeing then that we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." The most powerful tool that we have is the ability to speak to God and know that God's listening. It is an impressive thought that God's listening to me, that God's listening to you. And when you're in the throes of it, and you're fighting for your spiritual life, that should be the place that we turn. And I don't know how God's going to fix everything. It's kind of like the point this morning. How is it that God's going to see all of my needs if I seek first the kingdom? I don't know. I really don't. Robert Turner used to say, that's kind of whittling on God's end of the stick. God knows how He's going to help me. I do know that He's told me in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that with every temptation He provides a way of escape. And so I know it's there. And I don't know what else He may do. I don't know if providentially there's a phone call, a friend comes by, something happens to distract me from the temptation. I don't know all the way that God works. But I can tell you this. He sent Jesus to come and die on the cross. He called us by the gospel. He justified and made us innocent because we obeyed and put our trust in Jesus Christ. He has set us apart from the world. He has promised us eternal salvation. He is listening to our prayers. And according to Romans chapter 8, if He's done all of those things, who can separate us from God? Do you really believe He's going to desert you in the moment of temptation? So number 3 is ask for help. And then number 4 is the one that is the hard one. God's promise of help doesn't imply some kind of supernatural power for us. At some point, we have to stand up. And so number 4 is practice some discipline in your life. Turn over to James chapter 1 right quick. James chapter 1, and you're familiar, I'm sure, with this passage of Scripture. Beginning in verse 2, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." And we read that, and we sometimes debate, what does he mean when he talks about all kinds of trials? Well, we very often say, well, it may be a health issue, it may be a financial issue, it may be this, it may be that. It's interesting as you read on down in the same context, when he gets to verse 12, he says, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation. For when he has been proved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love Him. Let no one say when he's tempted, I'm tempted of God. God cannot be tempted with evil, neither does He Himself tempt anyone. Each is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. And when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. Sin, when it's finished, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren." And it's interesting, in the same context, he talks about trials and he talks about temptation. And I would propose to you there's probably not as much difference between those two things as we want to make them out to. Our trials are temptations. And our temptations very often come because of our desires. And even things like our health or our finances very often are appealing to our pride of life or our ego or our material well-being, our physical sense, as opposed to the spiritual. And the reality is what James tells us is, when you deal with these things, consider yourself blessed, because when you endure, you get stronger. It is the principle of lifting weights, of pushing against resistance to build your muscles up. And I'm convinced what James is saying is, the more you overcome temptation, the better you'll be prepared to deal with it the next time. And ultimately, he says, if you fall to sin, don't blame God. It's your fault. Now, given that, I am responsible, and we can excuse ourselves all day long. You older folks, you remember who Flip Wilson was? You know, the devil made you do it. No. The devil tempted you. You did it because you wanted to. We can't get away with that excuse with God on the day of judgment. We sin because we give in. And at some point, we have to not give in. So how do I get to that point? Well, I want to propose to you that you learn to practice discipline. That's what James says in verses 3 and 4. Knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, let patience have a perfect work. You have to deal with it. And the more you deal with it, the better off you get. In 2 Peter chapter 1 or Galatians chapter 5, one of the things we're going to add to our faith is self-control, temperance. One of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control, temperance. And we think of that usually only in two regards. Oh, my self-control revolves around either sexual desire or revolves around my anger. Well, my self-control revolves around a lot of things. It may address my ability to study on a regular basis. It may address my ego. It may address whether or not I'm given to covetousness and materialism. All of those things are issues of self-control. And God expects us to develop that. Why? Because if I can learn to control myself, and I know that Satan is appealing to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, and my mind is in control of my body, then I am prepared to deal with the temptations that are going to come at me. And so, let me propose to you that we learn to practice that. Have you ever studied fasting in the Bible? I've got a couple of friends that preach and they have sermons on fasting. And I think Christians need to fast. I don't have a sermon on fasting. And you want to know why? Because I want nothing to do with it. Okay? I'll hear people say, well, I'm going to tell you what, you fast, and I tell you what that does for you. It focuses your mind like nothing else does. Yes, it does. On a Whataburger with cheese. That's what it does. That's what it focuses my mind on. I have not got to that nirvana point where all of a sudden all material desires go away. I don't get the idea. But I tell you what I do get. You know, in the Old Testament, there's really only one time that God demanded fasting was on the Day of Atonement. And it referred to it as, Brady, you going to help me out here? No. I am not going to throw you under the bus on this one, but I could. Give me a second. It's not abusing the soul. But he talks about it in terms of self-battling, self-struggling. In much the same way that Paul, 1 Corinthians, talks about buffeting his body daily. Go read about the Day of Atonement. Look it up, and you'll see the phrase that drives me crazy. To do something to your soul. Okay? Fasting served a purpose, and the purpose, as much as anything else, was abusing yourself. The purpose, as much as anything else, was to teach your body that your mind was in control. And I really believe that's what fasting was intended to do, to show God, I am going to put aside my desires so that I can give myself to what you want me to do. I believe when Jesus talks about this kind doesn't go out except by prayer and fasting. There wasn't anything miraculous about the fasting. And the fasting somehow or the other didn't make the apostles stronger. What the fasting did was to focus the will of the apostles upon what God wanted and upon that strength instead of on the physical desire. And so there's a sense in which fasting is helpful. Because what you're doing is you're teaching your body that your mind is in control. My middle daughter and I go through periods of time where we don't eat sweets. Don't eat desserts. Kelly's laughing. Except peanut butter. Okay? Peanut butter's not on that plate. And we do that every so often, not for dieting purposes, not to try to lose weight. For me, it's just about being able to say no to what my body wants. Because I love chocolate, and peach cobbler, and bluebell ice cream, and Chips Ahoy extra chunky cookies. I mean, I love all that stuff, but if I'm telling my body, no, you're not going to do that, and the only reason you're not going to have that is because you are not going to be in control. You know what that does for you? It teaches you to practice willpower. So that when you're tempted in other ways, you've already practiced willpower. There's a lot of ways you can do that. You can exercise. I used to run pretty regularly. I hate running. I hate it with passion. I would do it simply for the benefit of self-control, of mind over physical. If it is an issue of getting up at a certain time, if it's an issue of studying your Bible at a certain time, there are a lot of ways that you can practice the power of your will over your physical body, and I believe that that's helpful. I'm convinced that's what the clean and the unclean things were about in the Old Testament. Well, why did God not allow them to eat pork? I've heard people say, well, pork carries lots of diseases. Well, there are a lot of other kind of animals that weren't prohibited. I'm convinced there was more to it than that. The reason that God didn't let them eat bacon is bacon smells good, tastes good. Bacon's good stuff. But you don't eat that, and the reason you don't eat it is because God said, I don't eat it. And I'm doing it for one purpose and one purpose only, because God said, I don't eat that. I don't touch that. I don't go here. I don't do that. And I am in control over things that I want to do. I'm going to tell you, the next time Satan tempts you with what you want to do, you will be better prepared to tell your lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, pride of the life, no, we are not going to do that. And then number 5, which we already talked about this morning. We're going to be serious about temptation. We're going to be spiritual in desiring to please our Father. We're going to ask for help. We're going to practice some self-control so we're ready when the process comes. And we're going to busy ourselves with doing stuff that's good. My dad told me a long time ago, I'd get a little frustrated with life or whatever, get irritated with life. And so I tell you what you need to do. You need to go do something good for somebody. And it was great wisdom, because when you are engaged in finding someone to help, in doing something good, you don't have time to think about yourself. And all sin revolves around thinking about yourself. And Satan knows that. And that's all the tools Satan has. And when you're not thinking about yourself, you take away all of the tools that he has over you. Jesus went about doing good. Matthew chapter 25, the sheep and the goats, the difference between them is one's always doing good. I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When the apostles are arguing in Matthew chapter 20 about who's greatest in the kingdom, what is it that Jesus tells them? Well, the Gentiles, they have people that rule over them. And the great ones, they have people that rule over them. But it's not going to be like that in my kingdom. In my kingdom, the least person is the greatest. And the one who desires to be seen is the one who goes and serves, just like the Son of God came to the earth, not to be served, but to serve. And I'm going to tell you, folks, if we will busy ourselves with going about being an influence for good in this world, we won't have a lot of time to think about the junk that we like to do. So, God tells us temptation is inevitable. Satan is out there like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. But in the very next verse, 1 Peter chapter 9, we're told to resist him steadfastly. And resistance, I would propose, demands a plan. So what are you going to do? Be serious. Be spiritual. Look for some help. Practice some discipline. Go do good. And Satan will flee from you. And we will be the people that God wants us to be. I hope those things will help you. I thank you for your attention tonight. If you're subject to invitation, you need to obey the gospel. Maybe you haven't dealt very well with temptation. You need to fix that. Or maybe you've never obeyed the gospel and had the opportunity to enjoy forgiveness because of the sacrifice of Christ. We can help you with those things. We invite you.